The morning briefing room buzzed with controlled chaos. Maps covered every surface, satellite feeds flickered across multiple screens, and the air carried the sharp scent of black coffee mixed with tension. 12 American contractors had vanished somewhere in the mountains of Eastern Europe, their convoy ambushed on a supply route that was supposed to be secure. The clock on the wall showed 72 hours since the last confirmed contact. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At the head of the room, Colonel James Morrison spread his hands flat against the mahogany table, his voice cutting through the murmur of hushed conversations. The rescue operation would launch at dawn. 3 Black Hawks, coordinated approach. Extraction zone secured by ground teams already in position. He rattled off call signs and flight patterns with military precision, each pilot receiving their assignment with a sharp nod of acknowledgement. Sarah Chun sat in the back row, her notebook open but her pen motionless. Her flight suit bore the same patches as the others, the same wings pinned above her left pocket, but somehow she occupied the space differently. Where the other pilots leaned forward, gesturing at the tactical displays, Sarah remained still. Her eyes moved across the room methodically, cataloging details that others seemed to miss. The slight hesitation in Morrison's voice when he mentioned the mountain weather. The way the intelligence officer's fingers drummed against his clipboard when discussing the hostage location. The fact that the backup helicopter assignment hadn't been announced yet. Around her, conversations flowed in the practice shorthand of military aviation. Captain Rodriguez joked about the outdated GPS coordinates, while Major Thompson questioned the fuel calculations for the extended mountain flight. Their voices carried the easy confidence of men who had flown together for years, who knew each other's flying styles and trusted each other's instincts without question. Sarah listened without participating, her presence acknowledged with occasional glances but never directly addressed. The briefing concluded with flight assignments, distributed on crisp white paper. Primary extraction team, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Lieutenant Hayes in the lead aircraft. Secondary support, Captain Williams and Major Burke in the covering formation. Sarah's name appeared at the bottom of the roster, listed under Reserve Aircraft, Standby Status. No specific role, no call sign designation, just a placeholder in case something went wrong with the primary plan. She folded the paper once and slipped it into her breast pocket without comment. The room emptied quickly as pilots moved to their pre-flight preparations, but Sarah remained seated until the last conversation faded down the hallway. Only then did she stand, gathering her materials with the same methodical care she applied to everything else. The flight line stretched before her like a ribbon of possibility in the pre-dawn darkness. 3 Black Hawk helicopters sat in perfect formation, their rotors folded back like sleeping birds. Ground crews moved between them with practiced efficiency, checking fuel lines and running final diagnostics. The primary aircraft gleamed under the harsh sodium lights, every surface polished and inspection ready. The second helicopter bore the marks of recent maintenance, fresh paint covering areas where panels had been replaced. At the far end of the line sat Sarah's aircraft. Older than the others by nearly a decade, it carried the scars of extended service. The paint had faded to a matte gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Small dents marked the fuselage where countless hours of training flights had taken their toll. The crew chief had apologized when he assigned it to her, explaining that the primary birds needed to be reserved for the actual mission. Sarah had simply nodded and signed the acceptance paperwork. Now, she approached the helicopter with the same attention she gave to everything else. Her flashlight beam moved across every surface, illuminating rivets and access panels that most pilots would trust the ground crew to inspect. She checked the hydraulic fluid levels personally, running her fingers along the lines to feel for any irregularities that might not show up on the gauges. Her logbook came out next, a thick volume, bound in black leather and filled with her precise handwriting. Every anomaly, every minor adjustment, every weather condition that might affect performance was recorded in margins that other pilots left blank. The cockpit welcomed her like an old friend. Sarah had flown this particular aircraft dozens of times during training exercises, familiarizing herself with its individual quirks and characteristics. The collective stick had a slight tendency to drift left after extended hover periods. The engine temperature gauge read 2 degrees high consistently. The radio occasionally picked up interference from the base's communication tower. None of these issues appeared in the official maintenance logs, but Sarah knew them intimately. She began her pre-flight checklist at 0400 hours, even though her standby status meant she wouldn't launch until called. The primary formation would depart at sunrise, leaving her to wait for orders that might never come. But Sarah had learned long ago that preparation couldn't be rushed or skipped, regardless of whether it would be needed. Her mother had taught her that lesson during long summers spent in the family's crop dusting business back in Nebraska. Every flight mattered, even the ones that seemed routine. The other pilots emerged from the operations building as the sky began to lighten. They moved with the confident stride of men heading into action, their gear bags slung over shoulders and their helmets tucked under their arms. Rodriguez caught sight of Sarah through her cockpit window and offered a casual wave. Thompson nodded in her direction as he passed. Their gestures were friendly but distant, acknowledging her presence without inviting her into their pre-mission ritual. Sarah watched them conduct their own pre-flight procedures with interest. Rodriguez spent most of his time reviewing the tactical navigation system, trusting his crew chief to handle the mechanical inspection. Thompson focused on radio checks and communication protocols, his voice carrying across the tarmac as he coordinated with the ground control tower. Hayes, the youngest of the primary pilots, seemed nervous despite his attempts to project confidence. His movements were slightly too quick, his responses to questions slightly too loud. The mountain weather report crackled over the common frequency just before sunrise. Clouds ceiling at 8,000 feet, visibility reduced by morning fog, crosswinds gusting up to 30 knots through the primary valley approaches. Not ideal conditions, but well within acceptable limits for experienced pilots flying modern aircraft. Morrison's voice acknowledged the report with professional calm, authorizing the mission to proceed as planned. Sarah continued her inspection routine. As the primary formation powered up, the deep whine of turbine engines filled the air, followed by the distinctive whop-whop of rotor blades beginning to turn. She felt the familiar vibration through the ground, the mechanical heartbeat that every helicopter pilot knew by instinct. One by one, the aircraft lifted off into the gray morning light, their navigation strobes blinking as they formed up and headed toward the mountains. Silence settled over the flight line like a blanket. The ground crews began their cleanup procedures, securing equipment and preparing for the long wait until the formation returned. Sarah remained in her cockpit, monitoring the radio traffic as the rescue mission proceeded toward its target. The voices were calm and professional, reporting checkpoint passages and weather observations with the routine efficiency of well-trained aviators. But Sarah noticed things that others might miss. The slight strain in Rodriguez's voice when he reported turbulence levels. The way Thompson had to repeat his last transmission because of static interference. The fact that Hayes hadn't spoken on the radio since departing the pattern. Small details that meant nothing individually but formed a pattern when considered together. She opened her personal flight manual, a collection of procedures and techniques that she had compiled over years of studying every available resource on mountain flying and combat search and rescue. The pages were filled with her own notes and diagrams, covering scenarios that weren't addressed in standard training curricula, high-altitude performance calculations, emergency landing procedures for unprepared surfaces, navigation techniques, For GPS-denied environments. Fuel conservation methods for extended missions. Her fellow pilots often joked about her obsessive preparation. They called her the professor behind her back, a nickname that wasn't entirely meant as a compliment. While they relied on experience and instinct, Sarah built detailed contingency plans for situations that might never occur. While they trusted their equipment and training, Sarah assumed that everything that could go wrong eventually would go wrong. The morning stretched on with painful slowness. Sarah monitored the radio frequencies, tracking the progress of the rescue mission through scattered transmissions and position reports. The primary formation had reached the target area and established contact with ground forces. Search patterns were being established to locate the missing contractors. Everything was proceeding according to plan. At 0847 hours, the first sign of trouble crackled over the emergency frequency. Rodriguez's voice, tight with concentration, reporting mechanical difficulties with his tail rotor. Nothing critical yet, but sufficient to warrant returning to base for inspection. Thompson acknowledged and took over as flight leader, adjusting the search pattern to compensate for the reduced aircraft availability. Sarah made a note in her logbook, but didn't react otherwise. Mechanical problems were part of aviation, especially in challenging conditions. The remaining 2 aircraft were fully capable of completing the mission, but she also began reviewing her fuel calculations and navigation charts, updating her mental picture of the tactical situation developing in the mountains. 15 minutes later, Thompson's aircraft developed its own problems. Hydraulic pressure warnings forced him to abort his portion of the search and head for the nearest friendly airfield. That left Hayes alone in the target area, a young pilot with limited experience trying to locate 12 hostages in mountainous terrain while dealing with deteriorating weather conditions. Morrison's voice came over the command frequency, calm but urgent. He ordered Hayes to continue the search while dispatching the standby aircraft to provide backup. Sarah's call sign echoed across the flight line for the first time that morning, followed by authorization to launch immediately. She had been ready for this moment since before dawn. Her engines were already warmed up, her navigation systems programmed with multiple route options, her fuel tanks topped off for maximum range. While other pilots might have needed 10 minutes to complete their pre-flight procedures, Sarah lifted off within 90 seconds of receiving her orders. The flight toward the mountains took her over terrain that few civilian pilots ever saw. Dense forests gave way to rocky foothills, which in turn surrendered to peaks that scraped the bottom of the overcast sky. Sarah flew with the intensity of someone who had studied every ridge and valley from satellite imagery, who had memorized the locations of emergency landing zones and alternate navigation checkpoints. Her radio crackled with updates from the search area. Hayes had located what appeared to be the missing convoy vehicles, burned out and abandoned in a narrow valley 20 miles from their last known position. But the hostages were nowhere to be found, and evidence suggested they had been moved to a secondary location deeper in the mountains. Sarah absorbed this information while calculating fuel consumption rates and weather deterioration patterns. The mission was becoming more complex by the hour, requiring decisions that went beyond standard search and rescue procedures. She began reviewing her notes on high-risk extraction techniques, preparing for scenarios that the original mission planners hadn't anticipated. The mountains rose before her like sleeping giants, their peaks hidden in clouds that grew darker. With each passing mile, Sarah checked her instruments once more, confirmed her navigation settings, and pressed deeper into the uncertain sky ahead. Behind her, the safe familiarity of the airbase faded into memory. Ahead lay a challenge that would test every skill she had ever learned and every preparation she had ever made. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The radio frequency filled with static as she climbed higher, the voices from base becoming increasingly distant and fragmented. Soon, she would be operating beyond the range of reliable communication, making decisions based on her own judgment and training. It was exactly the kind of situation that her methodical preparation had been designed to address. Sarah Chen flew toward the mountains alone, carrying with her the quiet confidence of someone who had never been given a chance to prove what she could do. The morning sun struggled through the overcast, casting shifting shadows across the cockpit as her helicopter disappeared into the uncertain terrain ahead. Sarah Chen's journey to this moment began 15 years earlier in the cornfields of Nebraska, where her grandfather's voice carried across acres of golden grain like a prayer whispered to the wind. "Flying isn't about the machine, Sarah," he would say, his weathered hands steady on the controls of the ancient Piper Cub as they traced irrigation patterns from 500 feet. "It's about understanding what the air wants to tell you." Those summer mornings started before dawn, when the mist still clung to the furrows and the air held the promise of thermals that wouldn't develop for hours. While other children slept, Sarah learned to read the subtle signs that preceded weather changes. The way morning fog collected in certain valleys, how wind patterns shifted when pressure systems moved through the region, the delicate dance between temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure that determined whether a pilot lived or died when things went wrong. Her grandfather, Thomas Chen, had flown supply missions over the Pacific during World War II. Never spoke about the combat, but Sarah could see it in the way he approached every flight with systematic thoroughness. No detail was too small to check twice. No procedure was routine enough to skip. His logbooks were works of art, filled with precise observations about wind conditions, fuel consumption, and mechanical performance that went far beyond what regulations required. After his death, Sarah found boxes of his notes hidden in the barn's loft. Hundreds of pages detailing advanced navigation techniques, emergency procedures, and theoretical calculations about aircraft performance under extreme conditions. He had continued studying aviation long after his flying days ended, accumulating knowledge that he passed to his granddaughter through summer lessons that seemed like games, but were actually graduate-level instruction in applied aerodynamics. Transition from crop dusters to military helicopters came through the University of Nebraska's ROTC program. Sarah's academic record was impeccable. Her physical fitness scores placed her in the top 5% of candidates, and her preliminary flight evaluations showed natural ability that impressed even seasoned instructors. But it was her approach to learning that set her apart from other cadets. While her classmates memorized procedures and practiced standard maneuvers, Sarah delved into the theoretical underpinnings of rotary wing flight. She studied vortex ring states and height velocity diagrams with the intensity of a doctoral candidate. Her notebooks contained detailed analyses of historical helicopter accidents, with hand-drawn diagrams showing how different pilot responses might have changed the outcomes. She calculated performance margins for aircraft operating at high-density altitudes, developing personal minimums that were more conservative than published limitations. Flight school at Fort Rucker revealed both her strengths and the challenges she would face throughout her military career. Technically, Sarah was flawless. Her instrument approaches were precise to within degrees and feet. Her emergency procedures were executed with textbook accuracy. Her written examinations scored higher than those of any student in her class year. But she struggled with the informal aspects of military aviation culture. The other students formed tight bonds through shared experiences of failure and success. They developed nicknames, traded stories, and built the camaraderie that would sustain them through years of dangerous missions. Sarah remained peripheral to these relationships, not through any hostility, but simply because her personality didn't align with the extroverted confidence that dominated military aviation. Her instructors noticed her exceptional technical skills but worried about her leadership potential. Military pilots were expected to make quick decisions under pressure, to project confidence even when uncertain, and to inspire trust in their crew members and fellow aviators. Sarah's methodical approach was valued, but her quiet demeanor raised questions about whether she could command respect in high-stress situations. The distinction followed her to her first operational assignment at Fort Campbell with the 101st Airborne Division. The unit's mission included air assault operations, medical evacuations, and special operations support throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. Sarah's squadron flew aging UH-60 Black Hawks that required constant maintenance and careful handling to operate safely in extreme environments. Her reputation as a perfectionist grew during deployment rotations to Afghanistan. While other pilots accepted aircraft with minor discrepancies, trusting that ground crews had properly evaluated the risks, Sarah insisted on personal inspection of every system. She discovered hydraulic leaks that had been missed during routine maintenance, identified avionics problems that could have caused navigation failures in mountainous terrain, and caught fuel system irregularities that might have led to engine failures during critical phases of flight. Some of her fellow pilots appreciated her attention to detail, especially when her discoveries prevented potential accidents. Others found her standards excessive and her methodical approach incompatible with the rapid pace of combat operations. The debate about her methods intensified after an incident during a medical evacuation mission in Helmand Province. Intelligence reports had cleared the landing zone, but Sarah noticed discrepancies in the terrain analysis that suggested possible enemy presence in overwatch positions. Her concerns were dismissed as overcaution by the mission commander, who ordered the evacuation to proceed as planned. Sarah complied, but insisted on modifying the approach profile to minimize exposure time in the potential kill zone. The landing zone came under rocket-propelled grenade fire just as her aircraft touched down. Sarah's modified approach had positioned her helicopter behind a small ridge that provided cover from the enemy positions she had identified. The wounded soldier was loaded successfully, and her aircraft escaped without damage. The mission commander's helicopter, following the standard approach profile, took small arms fire that damaged its tail rotor and forced an emergency landing. An investigation concluded that the enemy positions had been established after the intelligence collection, making their presence impossible to predict. Sarah's identification of the potential threat was attributed to luck rather than skill. Her personnel file noted her successful completion of the mission, but contained no mention of her tactical awareness or the lives her precautions may have saved. The pattern repeated throughout her career. Sarah's unconventional methods produced exceptional results, but her quiet demeanor and methodical approach didn't fit the image of a dynamic military aviator. She was promoted on schedule and received standard commendations, but never the high-profile assignments or leadership positions that went to pilots with more conventional personalities. Her transition to special operations aviation came through a side door. The unit needed pilots with extensive mountain flying experience for missions in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Sarah's personal study of high-altitude flight operations, combined with her mechanical aptitude and language skills, made her a valuable addition to the team. But even within the special operations community, she remained an outsider looking in. The pilots around her were elite performers, selected for their ability to operate independently under extreme conditions. They flew missions that required split-second decision-making, exceptional flying skills, and the confidence to operate without backup in hostile territory. Sarah possessed all these qualifications, but her quiet competence didn't translate into the kind of aggressive leadership that special operations culture valued. She compensated by becoming the unit's unofficial expert on everything that others found tedious. She maintained detailed databases of landing zone surveys, weather patterns, and enemy threat assessments. Her personal library included technical manuals for aircraft systems, that weren't even in their inventory, foreign language, dictionaries for regions they might someday visit, and theoretical papers on advanced flight techniques that pushed the boundaries of what helicopters could accomplish. While other pilots relaxed between missions, Sarah could be found in the maintenance hangar, learning how to troubleshoot problems that might occur far from base support. She studied engine teardown procedures, hydraulic system architectures, and electrical schematics with the same intensity that others devoted to tactical planning. Her goal wasn't to replace the ground crews, but to understand her aircraft so thoroughly that she could diagnose and potentially repair critical failures in the field. Her approach extended to human factors as well. Sarah researched the psychological effects of stress on pilot performance, studying how fatigue, fear, and time pressure influence decision-making in critical situations. She developed personal techniques for managing stress that went beyond standard military training, incorporating meditation practices, physical conditioning routines, and mental rehearsal exercises that helped her maintain focus during extended high-stress operations. The irony was that her exceptional preparation made her seem less capable to observers who equated confidence with competence. While other pilots projected certainty about their abilities, Sarah's acknowledgement of potential problems was interpreted as self-doubt. Her detailed contingency planning was seen as evidence that she lacked the instinctive judgment that distinguished elite aviators from merely competent ones. But Sarah had learned from her grandfather that true mastery came not from natural talent, but from relentless preparation for scenarios that others couldn't imagine. She had studied every historical case of helicopter operations in mountainous terrain, analyzing successful missions and catastrophic failures with equal attention to detail. She knew the performance characteristics of her aircraft better than the engineers who designed it, and she had developed personal techniques for maximizing capability in extreme environments. The foundation of excellence wasn't built in the classroom or during routine training flights. It was constructed through thousands of hours of study, preparation, and practice that occurred when no one was watching. Sarah understood that exceptional performance under pressure was the result of exceptional preparation during quiet moments. When preparation seemed unnecessary. Now, flying alone toward mountains where 12 lives hung in the balance, Sarah carried with her the accumulated wisdom of decades spent preparing for moments like this. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory as she climbed through the overcast, reminding her that flying wasn't about the machine, but about understanding what the air wanted to tell her. And today, the air was whispering secrets that only someone who had spent a lifetime listening would be able to hear. The conference room at Ramstein Air Base buzzed with the energy of 18 senior officers debating the future of helicopter operations in Eastern Europe. Sarah sat 3 chairs from the end of the polished oak table, her briefing folder closed while others gestured animatedly at projected images of terrain analysis and threat assessments. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, compiling operational data that challenged conventional wisdom about mountain rescue protocols. Colonel Morrison commanded the discussion from the head of the table, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been questioned in rooms like this. The topic was standardization of search and rescue procedures across all NATO Special Operations units. Current methods, he argued, were too dependent on individual pilot interpretation and needed systematic reform to ensure consistent results. Williams spoke next, outlining his proposal for centralized mission planning that would eliminate variables introduced by on-scene decision-making. His PowerPoint slides showed impressive statistics about response times and resource allocation, supported by data from recent exercises in the Alps and Carpathian Mountains. The room nodded approvingly as he concluded that success rates would improve dramatically under unified command structures. Sarah had spent 3 months analyzing the same operations data, reaching conclusions that directly contradicted Williams' recommendations. Her research showed that centralized planning failed catastrophically when field conditions deviated from pre-mission assumptions. The most successful rescues had occurred when experienced pilots were given latitude to modify procedures based on real-time observations that headquarters couldn't anticipate. When Morrison opened the floor for questions and comments, Sarah raised her hand. The conversation paused as eyes turned toward her, some curious, others mildly irritated by the interruption. She stood and moved to the projection screen, connecting her laptop without asking permission. Her presentation appeared immediately, showing a detailed breakdown of mission outcomes correlated with decision-making authority levels. The data was irrefutable. Operations that allowed pilot discretion and tactical execution had a 73% higher success rate than those managed entirely from remote command centers. Sarah highlighted specific cases where rigid adherence to predetermined plans had resulted in mission failures that could have been prevented by on-scene adjustments. Her analysis included weather deviation impacts, terrain assessment errors, and communication system limitations that weren't accounted for in theoretical planning models. The room fell silent as Sarah concluded her presentation. Her arguments were logically sound, backed by mathematical analysis that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying the proposed reforms. But instead of generating discussion, her data seemed to create an uncomfortable tension that hadn't existed moments before. Morrison cleared his throat and thanked Sarah for her interesting perspective. He noted that her analysis would be taken under consideration during the final review process. The phrasing was polite but dismissive, the kind of bureaucratic language that acknowledged input without committing to action. The meeting moved onto budget discussions and deployment schedules, leaving Sarah's recommendations hanging in the air like smoke that would dissipate by morning. After the session ended, Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah in the corridor outside the conference room. His expression was friendly but concerned, the look of someone delivering unwelcome advice with good intentions. He suggested that her presentation style might be perceived as challenging authority rather than providing helpful analysis. The data was impressive, he acknowledged, but the delivery could be interpreted as criticism of superior officers who had already invested political capital in alternative approaches. Sarah listened without responding, recognizing the familiar pattern that had shaped her entire military career. Technical competence was valued only when it supported predetermined conclusions. When evidence contradicted established positions, the messenger became the problem rather than the message. Her silence was interpreted as acceptance of the feedback, though she was actually calculating how long it would take for real-world events to prove her analysis correct. The validation came 6 weeks later during Exercise Northern Guardian, a multinational training scenario designed to test the new standardized procedures in simulated combat conditions. Sarah wasn't selected for the primary planning team, despite her expertise in mountain operations. Instead, she was assigned to the evaluation group, tasked with documenting how effectively the new protocols performed under realistic stress. The exercise began with textbook precision. Weather conditions matched the forecast, communication systems functioned flawlessly, and ground teams reported positions exactly on schedule. The rescue scenario unfolded according to plan, with centralized command directing helicopter movements through predetermined waypoints toward a simulated crash site in the Bavarian Alps. Sarah monitored the operation from a mobile command post, watching digital displays that showed aircraft positions overlaid on three-dimensional terrain maps. Everything appeared perfect from the command center perspective. Flight paths followed prescribed routes, timing matched planning estimates, and radio communications remained professional and concise. The new procedures seemed to be working exactly as designed, but Sarah had learned to watch for details that didn't appear on digital displays. She noticed subtle variations in pilot voice patterns that suggested increasing stress levels. Radio transmissions became slightly more clipped as the mission progressed, indicating pilots were experiencing workload pressures that hadn't been anticipated. Most significantly, several aircraft reported minor navigation discrepancies that were dismissed as equipment calibration issues rather than symptoms of larger problems. The crisis began when weather conditions changed faster than satellite predictions had indicated. Cloud formations developed rapidly along the primary approach corridor, reducing visibility below minimums for the planned flight path. The standardized procedures required aircraft to abort and return to base when weather fell below predetermined thresholds, but the crash victims were simulated medical emergency cases who couldn't survive extended delays. Sarah watched the dilemma unfold in real time. Centralized command had no provision for tactical modifications based on local conditions. The rigid protocols that looked efficient on paper became obstacles when reality refused to conform to theoretical models. Pilots requested permission to modify their approach routes, using alternative corridors that Sarah's analysis had identified months earlier. But the new procedures didn't include mechanisms for real-time plan adjustments. The exercise concluded with a simulated mission failure. Aircraft returned to base without reaching the rescue site, leaving the simulated casualties to expire while command structures debated authority hierarchies and policy interpretations. The after-action review focused on equipment malfunctions and communication problems, carefully avoiding discussion of systemic flaws in the centralized planning approach. Sarah submitted a detailed evaluation report that documented exactly what had gone wrong and why. Her analysis showed that pilots had correctly identified solutions to the tactical problems they encountered, but the command structure had prevented them from implementing effective responses. She included specific recommendations for modified procedures that would have allowed successful mission completion within existing safety parameters. Her report disappeared into the administrative machinery without generating any visible response. No follow-up meetings were scheduled to discuss her findings. No requests came for additional analysis or clarification of her recommendations. The document simply vanished into filing systems where inconvenient truths went to die quietly. 3 months later, Sarah received notification that she was being transferred to a new assignment. The orders were presented as a promotion opportunity, a chance to bring her analytical skills to bear on emerging challenges in a different theater of operations. But she recognized the transfer for what it actually was, a polite removal from an environment where her competence had become inconvenient. The pattern repeated itself with depressing regularity throughout her career. Sarah would identify problems, develop solutions, and present evidence that challenged conventional wisdom. Her analysis would be technically sound, her recommendations practical, and her methodology beyond criticism. But instead of generating change, her work would generate reassignment to positions where her insights could be safely ignored. She learned to recognize the warning signs that preceded each transfer, the subtle shift in how colleagues interacted with her after she presented unwelcome analysis, the way meeting invitations would stop arriving when controversial topics were being discussed, the careful phrasing and performance evaluations that praised her technical skills while questioning her ability to work effectively within established frameworks. The irony was that Sarah's predictions consistently proved accurate. The equipment failures she warned about would occur exactly as her models predicted. The procedural modifications she recommended would eventually be implemented after expensive failures demonstrated their necessity. The tactical innovations she proposed would become standard practice years later, after other pilots rediscovered the same solutions through trial and error. But military organizations operated on hierarchies and precedent, not on the merit of individual insights. Sarah's quiet competence was valued only when it supported existing power structures. When her expertise threatened established positions or challenged preferred narratives, she became a problem to be managed rather than a resource to be utilized. Final dismissal came during her assignment to the Special Operations Unit. Sarah had developed comprehensive threat assessments for operations in Eastern European mountain regions, identifying potential risks that weren't addressed in standard intelligence briefings. Her analysis showed that enemy forces had adapted their tactics to exploit weaknesses in NATO helicopter operations, making traditional rescue protocols increasingly dangerous. She presented her findings to the unit commander during a routine briefing session, explaining how minor modifications to flight profiles could dramatically reduce exposure to enemy fire while maintaining operational effectiveness. Her recommendations were based on careful study of recent engagements, mathematical modeling of ballistic trajectories, and extensive knowledge of helicopter performance characteristics in mountainous terrain. The briefing was received with polite attention and filed without comment. 2 weeks later, Sarah learned that her position was being eliminated due to budget constraints. Her duties would be redistributed among existing personnel, who could handle threat assessment responsibilities as additional duties. The timing was presented as coincidental, unrelated to her recent recommendations about operational security. Sarah accepted the news with the same quiet resignation that had characterized her response to previous dismissals. She had learned that challenging established thinking was a luxury that military careers couldn't afford. Excellence was rewarded only when it validated existing approaches, not when it exposed their limitations. Now, flying toward mountains where 12 American lives hung in the balance, Sarah carried with her the accumulated weight of every dismissed recommendation, every ignored analysis, and every transferred assignment that had marked her journey through military aviation. She had been dismissed as backup for so long that most people had forgotten she possessed capabilities that might matter when conventional approaches failed. But dismissal had taught her self-reliance. When others stopped listening to her insights, she had learned to trust her own judgment completely. When her recommendations were ignored, she had developed the confidence to act independently when action became necessary. The pattern of dismissal that had marginalized her career had also freed her from the constraints that limited less capable pilots. The mountains ahead held challenges that no centralized command could anticipate or solve through standardized procedures. Success would require exactly the kind of tactical flexibility and individual expertise that military bureaucracy had spent years trying to eliminate. Sarah smiled grimly as she adjusted her flight path, knowing that the same qualities that had made her inconvenient in conference rooms would make her indispensable in the crucible ahead. 3 days before the hostage crisis erupted, Sarah Chun stood alone in the intelligence archive room at 0230 hours, surrounded by classified reports. That painted a disturbing picture of escalating violence in the Carpathian Mountains. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across topographic maps that covered every available surface. While the rest of the base slept, Sarah methodically cross-referenced incident reports with weather patterns, terrain analysis, and enemy movement data that others had filed away without connecting the dots. The archive contained 16 months of operational intelligence from the region, thousands of pages of reports that had been processed, categorized, and stored according to standard procedures. Most analysts treated the information as historical data, useful for understanding past events, but not necessarily predictive of future threats. Sarah approached the same material with the systematic thoroughness that had defined her entire career. Looking for patterns that others had missed. Her attention focused on a series of seemingly unrelated events that had occurred along the mountain supply routes. Convoy delays attributed to mechanical failures, communication blackouts explained by equipment malfunctions, route changes justified by weather conditions. Individually, each incident appeared routine, the kind of minor problems that plagued military operations in difficult terrain. But when Sarah plotted them chronologically on her detailed maps, a different picture emerged. The pattern suggested coordinated surveillance of American logistics operations, with indigenous forces gathering intelligence about convoy schedules, communication procedures, and reaction times. The random mechanical failures occurred at geographic choke points, where ambush forces could observe without being detected. The communication blackouts happened during windows when backup support would be delayed by weather or terrain obstacles. The route changes followed predictable patterns that enemy forces could anticipate and exploit. Sarah's analysis revealed a sophisticated enemy intelligence network that had been operating undetected for over a year. The hostile forces weren't randomly attacking American assets. They were systematically studying American procedures and identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited when the stakes were high enough. The missing contractor convoy represented the culmination of months of preparation, not an opportunistic strike. She compiled her findings into a comprehensive threat assessment that included detailed predictions about enemy capabilities, likely tactics, and potential rescue complications. The document ran to 47 pages, with appendices containing mathematical models of helicopter performance in mountainous terrain, weather analysis showing seasonal patterns that affected flight operations, and tactical recommendations for operating in areas where enemy forces had established surveillance networks. The report also included something that no standard intelligence product contained: specific contingency plans for scenarios that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. Sarah had calculated fuel requirements for extended search operations in GPS-denied environments. She had identified emergency landing sites that weren't marked on official charts but could accommodate helicopter operations under extreme circumstances. Most importantly, she had developed infiltration routes that avoided known enemy observation points while maintaining access to areas where hostages might be held. Her preparation extended beyond theoretical analysis to practical reconnaissance that she conducted during officially sanctioned training flights. While other pilots used routine missions to practice standard procedures, Sarah used them to gather intelligence about terrain features that might become critical during emergency operations. She photographed ridgelines from multiple angles, noting how shadows and weather conditions affected visibility at different times of day. She mapped wind patterns through mountain valleys, identifying areas where turbulence could threaten aircraft safety or where favorable conditions might provide tactical advantages. The hangar became her laboratory during off-duty hours. Sarah had requisitioned technical manuals for aircraft systems that weren't part of standard pilot training, studying electrical schematics and hydraulic diagrams with the intensity of an engineer designing new equipment. She learned to diagnose problems that ground crews might miss, understanding her helicopter's capabilities and limitations at a level that few pilots ever achieved. Her personal toolkit expanded to include specialized equipment that wasn't issued through normal supply channels. She purchased high-resolution binoculars optimized for mountain environments where atmospheric conditions could distort normal vision. She acquired handheld GPS units with extended battery life and encrypted communication capabilities that could function when standard aircraft systems failed. Most unusually, she had assembled a collection of regional maps that showed details omitted from military charts, including footpaths, seasonal water sources, and local landmarks that could serve as navigation references. The preparation wasn't limited to technical matters. Sarah had spent months studying the cultural and linguistic characteristics of the region where American forces operated. She learned enough of the local language to communicate basic concepts, understanding that successful rescue operations might require interaction with civilian populations who could provide critical intelligence about enemy movements and hostage locations. She researched historical conflicts in the area, identifying ethnic and political tensions that might influence how different groups would react to American military presence. Her physical conditioning followed a regimen designed specifically for high-altitude operations in mountainous terrain. While other pilots maintained general fitness standards, Sarah trained for the specific physiological demands of extended flight operations in thin air and extreme weather conditions. She practiced emergency procedures until they became automatic responses, knowing that crisis situations would leave no time for conscious decision-making about technical procedures. The night before the hostage crisis began, Sarah received intelligence updates that confirmed her worst predictions. Enemy forces had demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of American convoy procedures, suggesting that the missing contractors were victims of a carefully planned operation rather than a random attack. The rescue mission would face threats that weren't addressed in standard search and rescue protocols, requiring tactical modifications that conventional planning couldn't anticipate. She spent the pre-dawn hours updating her contingency plans. Based on the latest intelligence, recalculating fuel requirements for extended operations and identifying alternative communication methods that could function in hostile environments. Her personal flight bag was packed with equipment that wasn't part of standard loadouts: emergency medical supplies selected for trauma scenarios, survival gear optimized for mountain environments, and communication devices that could operate independently of aircraft systems. The briefing room dynamics that morning revealed how thoroughly her preparation had been ignored by the official planning process. While Sarah possessed detailed knowledge about enemy capabilities and terrain challenges, the mission commanders focused on standard procedures that assumed cooperative weather and minimal enemy interference. Her attempts to share critical intelligence were dismissed as overcomplicated analysis that would only confuse the primary rescue teams. But Sarah had learned to prepare for scenarios where her expertise wouldn't be officially recognized until after it became desperately needed. Her personal mission planning included contingencies for situations that optimistic headquarters assessments hadn't considered. She had identified rally points for regrouping if the mission became separated, calculated fuel reserves for extended search operations, and developed communication protocols for operating beyond radio range of supporting units. The systematic preparation that others found excessive had been shaped by a career spent watching preventable failures occur because someone hadn't considered low-probability, high-impact scenarios. Sarah understood that exceptional circumstances required exceptional preparation, and that the margin between success and catastrophe was often determined by details that seemed insignificant until they became critical. Her helicopters sat at the end of the flight line, loaded with extra fuel and equipped with systems that weren't part of standard configurations. The aircraft's navigation system contained waypoints for locations that didn't appear on official maps, including alternate landing sites that Sarah had personally surveyed and deemed suitable for emergency operations. Her survival kit included items specifically selected for mountain environments, where standard equipment might prove inadequate under extreme conditions. As she lifted off into the uncertain morning, Sarah carried with her the accumulated wisdom of years spent preparing for moments that conventional thinking deemed impossible. Her route toward the mountains had been planned to avoid known enemy observation points while maintaining flexibility for tactical adjustments based on real-time conditions. Her fuel load would allow extended search operations that standard mission planning hadn't anticipated. The radio crackled with updates from the failing primary mission, confirming that the rescue operation was encountering exactly the complications that Sarah's analysis had predicted. Enemy forces were demonstrating knowledge of American procedures that suggested months of preparation. Weather conditions were deteriorating faster than meteorological models had forecast. The missing contractors were located in terrain that made conventional rescue approaches extremely dangerous. Sarah flew toward the mountains with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for this specific moment, while others would have to improvise solutions to unexpected problems. She had already developed procedures for scenarios that seemed impossible until they became reality. Her preparation wasn't just about technical competence or tactical knowledge. It was about understanding that exceptional challenges required exceptional responses, and that the difference between success and failure was often determined by work that no one else saw or appreciated. The morning sun climbed higher as Sarah's helicopter disappeared into the mountain haze, carrying with it the most thoroughly prepared rescue operation that had never been officially planned. Behind her, the base settled into the routine of waiting for updates from a mission that was about to exceed everyone's expectations, except those of the pilot who had been preparing for this moment since the day she learned that dismissal and preparation were not mutually exclusive, but rather complementary aspects of the same professional dedication that would soon be tested in ways that no training manual could fully describe. Sarah's helicopter carved through mountain air that had turned hostile, each ridgeline potentially concealing enemy positions that could end her mission before it truly began. The GPS display showed her approaching the coordinates where intelligence suggested the hostage compound was located. But Sarah knew that electronic navigation would be useless once she entered the valley system, where enemy jamming equipment had been detected. She switched to the navigation techniques her grandfather had taught her during those Nebraska summers, reading the terrain like a language that spoke through shadows and wind patterns. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountainsides, creating natural concealment that she could exploit while approaching the target area. Her aircraft descended into the valley system using terrain masking that kept her below enemy radar coverage while maintaining enough altitude to execute emergency maneuvers if hostile fire erupted. The compound appeared exactly where her intelligence analysis had predicted, a cluster of concrete buildings built into a natural depression that provided protection from aerial observation. Sarah counted 12 structures arranged in a defensive pattern, with guard towers positioned to overlook the primary approach routes that conventional helicopter tactics would require. The enemy had chosen their location carefully, creating a fortress that could withstand direct assault by superior forces. But Sarah hadn't come to assault the compound. She had come to extract 12 American contractors without engaging in the kind of prolonged firefight that would endanger the hostages she was trying to rescue. Her approach required precision, stealth, and timing that left no margin for error. She had studied similar operations throughout aviation history, analyzing successful rescues that had been accomplished by pilots who understood that sometimes the most audacious plan was also the most practical. She circled the compound at maximum standoff distance, using her aircraft's optics to gather intelligence about enemy positions and defensive preparations. The guards were alert and well-equipped, but their attention was focused on the obvious approach routes that standard military doctrine would dictate. They had positioned themselves to repel conventional attacks, not to detect a single helicopter operating with the kind of tactical innovation that Sarah had spent years developing. The hostages were being held in a central building that offered protection from external fire, but also limited the guards' ability to observe Sarah's approach. Intelligence reports suggested that the captives were being kept in a basement facility, which would provide additional protection during a rescue attempt but also complicated extraction procedures. Sarah would need to land her helicopter close enough to the building to minimize exposure time while maintaining enough distance to avoid being trapped by enemy fire. She identified a landing zone that didn't appear on any tactical map, a narrow strip of relatively flat ground that was screened from most guard positions by the compound's own defensive structures. The area was too small for conventional helicopter operations, requiring approach angles and landing techniques that pushed her aircraft to the limits of its performance envelope. But Sarah had practiced similar maneuvers during her private training sessions, developing skills that other pilots had never attempted. The descent began with mathematical precision, every control input calculated to minimize noise and visual signature, while maintaining the power margins necessary for emergency escape. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with the fluidity of someone who had rehearsed this exact scenario countless times in her mind. adjusting for wind conditions and terrain effects that would have challenged pilots with twice her experience. At 50 feet above the ground, enemy sentries detected her approach. Shouts echoed across the compound as guards scrambled to defensive positions. But Sarah's unconventional approach had placed her aircraft in a position where most of them prepared. Fire lanes were blocked by the compound's own buildings. She touched down in the improvised landing zone just as the first hostile fire began to crack overhead. The aircraft skids making contact with rocky soil that had never been designed to support helicopter operations. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Martinez, was already moving before the aircraft came to a complete stop. He had volunteered for the mission despite direct orders to remain at base, understanding that Sarah's chances of success would be dramatically improved by having experienced ground support. Martinez carried specialized equipment for breaching locked doors and providing security during the extraction. His training adapted to the unique requirements of hostage rescue operations. The building entry was accomplished with explosive charges that Martinez had precisely calculated to breach the basement access without endangering the hostages inside. The blast echoed through the compound like thunder, triggering additional enemy fire that forced Sarah to reposition her helicopter to maintain covering fire positions. Her door gunner engaged hostile positions with disciplined precision, creating suppression patterns that kept enemy forces pinned while Martinez worked to locate and extract the captives. The 12 American contractors were found exactly where intelligence had indicated, confined in a basement facility that showed signs of hasty preparation. The hostages were physically weak from their captivity, but mentally alert, responding to Martinez's instructions with the disciplined cooperation of people who understood that their survival depended on following rescue procedures without question. The extraction sequence began immediately, with hostages being moved to the helicopter in groups that minimized exposure to enemy fire. Sarah coordinated the entire operation from her cockpit, maintaining radio communication with Martinez while simultaneously flying defensive maneuvers that kept enemy forces off balance. Her aircraft moved in unpredictable patterns around the compound, using terrain features and structural obstacles to deny enemy gunners clear fields of fire while maintaining covering positions that protected the extraction team. The tactical situation deteriorated as additional enemy forces converged on the compound from surrounding positions. Sarah's intelligence analysis had predicted this response, but the actual enemy numbers exceeded her estimates. Hostile fire was intensifying, and her aircraft was beginning to show signs of damage from small arms impacts that threatened critical systems. The extraction had to be completed quickly, or the mission would fail with casualties that would make the rescue attempt meaningless. Martinez's voice crackled through the radio as the final group of hostages reached the helicopter. All personnel aboard, ready for immediate departure. His transmission was barely audible over the sound of enemy fire that was now concentrated on Sarah's aircraft, forcing her to execute evasive maneuvers that tested her flying skills to their absolute limits. The takeoff was the most dangerous phase of the operation, requiring Sarah to lift her overloaded aircraft from a confined area while under direct enemy fire. The helicopter's performance was degraded by the additional weight of 12 rescued hostages, reducing climb rate and maneuverability at the exact moment when both were most critical for survival. Sarah compensated by using ground effects and terrain features to mask her aircraft's escape route, employing techniques that she had developed during years of studying helicopter operations in hostile environments. Enemy fire followed her aircraft as it climbed away from the compound, tracer rounds creating deadly patterns in the air around her helicopter. Sarah flew with the precision of someone who had calculated every aspect of the escape route, using ridgelines and terrain features to break enemy targeting solutions while maintaining enough airspeed to avoid being trapped by pursuing forces. Her navigation was instinctive, based on landmarks and terrain features that she had memorized during her approach flight. The radio crackled with transmissions from command and control as news of the successful rescue spread through military communication networks. Sarah's achievement was being reported in real time to senior commanders who had written off the hostage rescue mission as impossible after the conventional approach had failed. Her solo operation had accomplished objectives that entire squadrons hadn't been able to achieve, demonstrating capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about helicopter operations in hostile environments. But Sarah's focus remained on the immediate tactical situation. Her aircraft had sustained damage that affected its performance, and she was flying through mountainous terrain that offered limited options for emergency landing if mechanical failures occurred. The rescued hostages required medical attention that couldn't be provided during flight, and her fuel reserves were depleting faster than planned due to the combat maneuvering required during the extraction. She navigated toward a secure landing zone that she had identified during her mission planning, a location that would provide medical support for the rescued hostages, while allowing her aircraft to be inspected for battle damage. The flight required precision navigation through terrain that challenged her aircraft's reduced performance capabilities, but Sarah's preparation had included contingencies for exactly these circumstances. The landing was executed with the same precision that had characterized the entire mission. Sarah's aircraft touching down at the secure facility with rescued hostages who were alive, alert, and ready to be reunited with their families. Medical personnel rushed to assist the contractors, while maintenance crews began assessing the helicopter damage that told the story of a mission that had succeeded against impossible odds. Sarah remained in her cockpit for several minutes after shutting down the engines, her hands still resting on controls that had responded to every command during the most challenging flight of her career. The silence that followed the engine shutdown was profound, broken only by the voices of people who were processing the reality of what had just been accomplished by a pilot who had been dismissed as backup until the moment when backup became the only option that mattered. The extraordinary achievement was complete, but Sarah understood that its significance extended beyond the successful rescue of 12 American contractors. She had demonstrated that individual excellence could overcome institutional limitations when circumstances demanded performance that exceeded conventional capabilities. Her solo mission had succeeded not because she had ignored military doctrine, but because she had developed capabilities that transcended the limitations of standard procedures. When standard procedures proved inadequate for exceptional circumstances, the Pentagon briefing room had never hosted a presentation quite like the one that General Patricia Hawkins was about to deliver. 3 rows of senior military officials sat in uncomfortable silence, their attention focused on tactical displays that showed the flight path of a single helicopter through hostile territory that conventional wisdom had deemed impenetrable. The mission data told a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about helicopter operations, individual pilot capabilities, and the effectiveness of military planning procedures. Sarah Chun stood at the back of the room, her dress uniform bearing the same ribbons it had worn for years, with one notable addition. The Distinguished Flying Cross had been pinned above her other decorations just hours earlier in a private ceremony that avoided the publicity that her rescue mission had generated throughout the military establishment. She had requested minimal recognition, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves rather than seeking the attention that her achievement had inevitably attracted. General Hawkins began her presentation with operational statistics that painted a sobering picture of the failed conventional rescue attempt. 3 helicopters had been damaged or destroyed, 4 aircrew members had been wounded, and the original mission had been abandoned without achieving any of its tactical objectives. The enemy had demonstrated sophisticated capabilities that exceeded intelligence estimates, employing coordinated tactics that exploited weaknesses in standard American helicopter operations. The contrast with Sarah's solo mission was stark and undeniable. She had penetrated the same hostile territory that had defeated a multi-aircraft formation, located and extracted 12 American hostages without sustaining casualties, and returned safely despite operating alone and without backup support. Her success had been achieved using tactics that weren't part of official training curricula, employing techniques that she had developed through years of independent study and preparation. The briefing room's atmosphere shifted as General Hawkins displayed Sarah's mission analysis, the 47-page document that had predicted the enemy capabilities and tactical challenges with remarkable accuracy. The intelligence assessment had been filed and forgotten when it was originally submitted, dismissed as overly complex analysis that wouldn't be relevant to actual operations. Now it was being studied as a masterpiece of predictive intelligence that had anticipated every major challenge the rescue mission would face. Colonel Morrison, who had commanded the original rescue planning, sat in the front row with the expression of someone confronting uncomfortable truths about his own limitations. His standardized procedures had failed catastrophically when confronted with adaptive enemy tactics, while the unconventional approaches he had dismissed as impractical had succeeded brilliantly when implemented by a pilot who understood their theoretical foundations and practical applications. The discussion that followed revealed the depth of institutional change that Sarah's mission had triggered throughout the military aviation community. Training programs were being revised to incorporate the tactical innovations she had demonstrated. Intelligence analysis procedures were being modified to emphasize the kind of predictive assessment that her work had exemplified. Most significantly, promotion and assignment policies were being reviewed to ensure that technical competence wouldn't be overlooked in favor of conventional leadership characteristics. Sarah listened to the discussion without participating, her presence acknowledged but her input not requested. The irony wasn't lost on her that a room full of senior officers was debating the implications of her work while she remained as peripheral to the conversation as she had been throughout her career. But the discussion itself represented a form of recognition that was more meaningful than any ceremony or decoration. The rescued hostages had provided their own testimony about Sarah's mission, describing their extraction with the kind of detail that only people who had lived through the experience could provide. Their accounts painted a picture of professionalism and precision that contradicted stereotypes about what individual pilots could accomplish when operating beyond the reach of conventional support systems. They had witnessed firsthand the results of preparation that others had dismissed as excessive, seeing how Sarah's methodical approach had created the margin of safety that enabled their successful rescue. Dr. Michael Stevens, one of the rescued contractors, had submitted a formal letter describing Sarah's mission that was now part of the official record. His account emphasized not just the technical brilliance of her flying, but the calm confidence she had projected during the most dangerous phases of the operation. The hostages had felt safe in her hands, trusting her judgment even when they couldn't understand the tactical decisions she was making. The media attention that followed the rescue had been carefully managed to protect operational security, but news of the successful mission had spread throughout the military community and beyond. Sarah's achievement was being studied at military academies, analyzed in professional journals, and discussed in forums where aviation professionals debated the lessons that could be learned from her unconventional approach to an impossible mission. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. A package arrived at Sarah's quarters 3 weeks after the rescue, containing a leather-bound flight manual that had belonged to her grandfather. The accompanying letter was from her grandmother, who had kept Thomas Chun's aviation library intact since his death decades earlier. The letter explained that her grandfather had always believed that Sarah possessed the kind of instinctive understanding of flight that couldn't be taught in schools or measured by conventional standards. The flight manual contained her grandfather's personal notes about unconventional flying techniques, including detailed analyses of emergency procedures, that bore striking similarities to the methods Sarah had used during her rescue mission. The margins were filled with observations about the psychological aspects of aviation, emphasizing the importance of preparation, mental discipline, and the courage to act independently when circumstances demanded decisions that others couldn't. Sarah discovered that her grandfather had documented many of the same tactical innovations that she had developed independently, suggesting that her approach to aviation had been influenced by lessons learned but not consciously remembered from those childhood summers in Nebraska. The genetic and educational foundations of her capabilities had been established decades earlier, requiring only the right circumstances to emerge as the exceptional performance that had saved 12 lives. The military's institutional response to her achievement was comprehensive and lasting. The Sarah Chun Protocol was established as a new framework for individual pilot operations in hostile environments, codifying the techniques she had demonstrated while maintaining the flexibility that had made her success possible. Training programs were developed to identify and cultivate pilots who possessed the analytical capabilities and independent judgment that her mission had exemplified. More importantly, the promotion and assignment systems were revised to ensure that technical competence would receive appropriate recognition alongside traditional leadership qualities. Sarah's career pattern of being dismissed despite exceptional capabilities had been identified as a systemic problem that had potentially wasted valuable expertise throughout the military aviation community. The changes extended beyond individual recognition to fundamental alterations in how the military approached complex operational challenges. Sarah's predictive intelligence analysis had demonstrated the value of thorough preparation over optimistic assumptions, leading to new requirements for operational planning that emphasized worst-case scenarios rather than best-case hopes. Equipment innovations were being studied and potentially adopted for standard issue. The specialized navigation techniques she had developed for GPS denied environments were being incorporated into pilot training programs. Most significantly, her approach to aircraft maintenance and system understanding was being taught as a model for the kind of technical mastery that could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The rescued hostages remained in contact with Sarah, their letters expressing gratitude that went beyond simple thanks for their rescue. They had witnessed something extraordinary, and they understood that their survival had been made possible by capabilities that transcended normal military training and preparation. Their families had sent photographs and messages that Sarah kept in a folder beside her grandfather's flight manual, tangible reminders of the human cost of the institutional dismissal that had characterized her career. Sarah's response to the recognition was characteristically quiet and practical. She continued her methodical approach to flying and mission preparation, treating her rescue mission as a single example of what could be accomplished when preparation met opportunity. She didn't seek additional high-profile assignments or attempt to leverage her newfound recognition into career advancement. Instead, she focused on sharing her knowledge with younger pilots who might benefit from the lessons she had learned. The training program she developed emphasized not just technical skills but the mental discipline required to operate independently under extreme pressure. Her instruction methods focused on developing the kind of analytical thinking that could identify solutions to problems that hadn't been encountered before, preparing pilots for scenarios that conventional training couldn't anticipate. The legacy of Sarah's mission extended far beyond the successful rescue of 12 American contractors. She had demonstrated that individual excellence could overcome institutional limitations when circumstances demanded performance that exceeded conventional capabilities. Her quiet competence had been vindicated by results that couldn't be dismissed or marginalized, creating a precedent that would influence military aviation for decades to come. As Sarah stood in the Pentagon briefing room, listening to senior officers debate the implications of her work, She understood that her achievement represented more than a successful rescue mission. It was validation of an approach to excellence that emphasized preparation over publicity, competence over charisma, and results over recognition. The dismissal that had characterized her career had ended not with dramatic speeches or ceremony, but with the quiet acknowledgement that when everything else failed, her capabilities had been exactly what was needed. The morning light streaming through the briefing room windows reminded Sarah of countless other mornings when she had prepared for missions that others deemed routine. But she had learned that no mission was routine when lives depended on the outcome, and that the margin between success and failure was often determined by work that no one else saw or appreciated. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that flying wasn't about the machine, but about understanding what the air wanted to tell her. And today, the air was whispering that excellence, once proven, could never be dismissed again. 10 years had passed since Sarah Chun's name had first appeared in military dispatches as the pilot who accomplished the impossible, and the world had changed in ways that even her analytical mind couldn't have predicted. The Sarah Chun Institute for Advanced Aviation had become a global center of excellence, its research facilities spanning 3 continents and its graduates serving in military and civilian organizations worldwide. But on this particular morning, as Sarah prepared for what would be her final official flight as an active duty officer, she carried with her the same quiet determination that had defined her entire career. The aircraft waiting for her on the Va. Tarmac was a new generation helicopter that incorporated design innovations directly inspired by her rescue mission. The manufacturers had studied her techniques for operating in hostile environments, developing systems that enhanced pilot capabilities rather than replacing human judgment. The cockpit displays showed information in formats that Sarah had pioneered, presenting complex data in ways that enabled rapid decision-making under extreme pressure. But today's flight wasn't a combat mission or a rescue operation. It was a demonstration flight for the newest class of international students at the Institute, young pilots from 43 countries who had come to study the principles that Sarah had developed through decades of preparation and practice. Their faces showed the mixture of excitement and nervousness that she remembered from her own early training, when the possibilities of aviation had seemed infinite, but the challenges had appeared overwhelming. Captain Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's most accomplished protege, conducted the pre-flight briefing with the precision and thoroughness that had become the Institute's trademark. Her presentation covered not just the technical aspects of the demonstration, but the philosophical principles that guided Sarah's approach to aviation. Excellence wasn't achieved through natural talent or lucky breaks, but through relentless preparation for scenarios that others couldn't imagine. The international students represented the global expansion of Sarah's influence, their presence, testament to how her methods had transcended national boundaries and service rivalries. Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka from the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force had used Sarah's navigation techniques to locate survivors of a tsunami in conditions that had defeated conventional search methods. Major Hans Müller from the German Air Force had applied her analytical approach to develop new procedures for medical evacuation in urban environments. Sarah's flight plan for the demonstration included a route through the same mountain terrain where her rescue mission had taken place a decade earlier. The area had been transformed into a training facility where pilots could practice the techniques she had pioneered, but the fundamental challenges remained unchanged. The mountains still generated unpredictable weather patterns, the terrain still demanded precise navigation, and the thin air still tested aircraft performance to its limits. As she lifted off, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft responding to her touch, the mechanical systems translating her intentions into flight with the precision that only came from years of experience. But this flight was different from the thousands that had preceded it. This was her farewell to active duty, her final opportunity to demonstrate the principles that had guided her career and influenced a generation of aviators. The first phase of the demonstration focused on navigation in GPS-denied environments. Using the visual landmarks and atmospheric conditions that Sarah had learned to read during her grandfather's crop dusting lessons, the students followed her route on their displays, watching as she identified terrain features and wind patterns that weren't visible on their electronic systems. Her commentary over the radio was calm and instructional, breaking down complex observations into understandable components. The second phase involved high-altitude operations in terrain that pushed helicopter performance to its limits. Sarah demonstrated the mathematical calculations that enabled safe flight at altitudes where engine power was reduced and control authority was marginal. Her techniques for managing power margins and maintaining safety buffers had been incorporated into training curricula worldwide, but seeing them applied by their original developer provided insights that couldn't be captured in textbooks. Final phase of the demonstration recreated the tactical challenges that Sarah had overcome during her rescue mission, showing how individual pilot capabilities could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. She flew through simulated hostile environments, demonstrating the stealth techniques and terrain masking that had enabled her to penetrate enemy-controlled territory. The students watched in fascination as she executed maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of what they had thought possible. But the most significant aspect of the demonstration wasn't technical, it was philosophical. Sarah's approach to aviation represented a fundamental shift from the traditional emphasis on aggressive confidence to a newer model that valued analytical thinking and methodical preparation. Her success had proven that quiet competence could be more effective than dramatic bravado, that careful planning could overcome superior numbers, and that individual excellence could transform entire institutions. As the demonstration concluded, Sarah landed her aircraft at the Institute's main facility, where the international students gathered for the debriefing session that would crystallize the lessons of the flight. Her presentation focused not on the specific techniques she had demonstrated, but on the thinking processes that had enabled their development. Aviation excellence came from understanding the fundamental principles that governed flight, weather, and human performance, then applying those principles to solve problems that others couldn't imagine. The questions from the students revealed the depth of their engagement with the material. They asked about decision-making under pressure, about maintaining precision when conventional systems failed, and about developing the mental discipline required for independent operations. Sarah's answers drew from decades of experience, but they also reflected the continuous learning that had characterized her entire career. Colonel Martinez, now the Institute's deputy director, joined the debriefing to discuss the broader implications of Sarah's methods. His own transformation from crew chief to senior officer exemplified the institutional changes that her mission had inspired. The military had learned to recognize and develop different types of excellence, creating pathways for advancement that valued technical competence alongside traditional leadership qualities. The afternoon brought Sarah's final administrative duties as an active duty officer. Her retirement ceremony would take place the following week, but the paperwork and transitions had to be completed according to military protocol. Her personnel file had grown thick with commendations, awards, and documentation of her influence on aviation training, but Sarah knew that her real legacy lived in the minds of the pilots she had trained and the institutions she had transformed. Rescued hostages had maintained their connection to Sarah throughout the decades since their rescue, their periodic letters and visits serving as reminders of the human cost of institutional failure and the power of individual excellence to overcome systematic limitations. Dr. Stevens had established a scholarship program that had funded aviation education for hundreds of students, ensuring that Sarah's influence would continue to expand through future generations. The international impact of her work had exceeded everyone's expectations. The Chun Protocol had been adopted by NATO forces, incorporated into United Nations peacekeeping operations, and adapted by civilian rescue organizations worldwide. Her techniques for operating in hostile environments had applications far beyond military aviation, influencing everything from disaster response to commercial flight safety. But perhaps the most significant measure of Sarah's legacy was found in the institutional changes that her mission had inspired. Military promotion systems had been reformed to recognize technical excellence. Training programs had been redesigned to emphasize analytical thinking, and leadership development had been expanded to include the kind of quiet competence that Sarah represented. The changes had created opportunities for thousands of officers who might otherwise have been overlooked. As evening approached, Sarah found herself alone in her office, surrounded by the maps and technical manuals that had been her constant companions throughout her career. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for the Institute, new students to train, and new problems to solve. But her role would be different, transitioning from active duty officer to civilian educator, from military pilot to academic researcher. The transition represented both an ending and a beginning. Her military career was concluding, but her influence on aviation would continue to grow through the students she had trained and the institutions she had transformed. The knowledge she had accumulated through decades of study and practice would be preserved and expanded by others who shared her commitment to excellence and innovation. Her grandfather's flight manual sat open on her desk, its pages yellow with age, but its wisdom still relevant to the challenges facing modern aviation. The techniques he had developed during World War II had influenced her approach to flying, and now those same principles were being passed to a new generation of aviators who would face threats that neither she nor her grandfather could have imagined. The Medal of Honor that hung on her office wall was a symbol of individual recognition, but Sarah understood that her real achievement was measured in the collective advancement of human capabilities. She had proven that excellence could overcome institutional limitations, that individual preparation could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances, and that quiet competence could create lasting change in organizations that had previously resisted reform. As she prepared to leave her office for the final time as an active duty officer, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from the margins of military aviation to the center of international recognition. The dismissal that had characterized her early career had ultimately become the foundation for changes that would influence aviation for generations to come. The night sky outside her window was clear and infinite, filled with stars that had guided aviators for centuries and would continue to guide them long after her own flight had ended. Sarah understood that her contribution to aviation was just one chapter in a story that had begun with the first human who looked up at the sky and dreamed of flight, and would continue as long as people possessed the courage to push the boundaries of what was possible. The quiet revolution that her mission had sparked continued to spread through military institutions, civilian organizations, and individual lives around the world. Her techniques were being taught in flight schools, her principles were being applied to challenges she had never imagined, and her example was inspiring people who would never set foot in an aircraft, but who understood that excellence could overcome any obstacle. Tomorrow would bring her retirement ceremony, where she would be honored for her service and celebrated for her achievements. But tonight, as she sat in her office surrounded by the tools of her trade, Sarah knew that her real legacy wasn't measured in ceremonies or awards, but in the lives that had been saved, the institutions that had been transformed, and the young pilots who would carry her knowledge forward into an uncertain but promising future. The echo of excellence would continue to reverberate through the infinite sky, carried forward by aviators who understood that the margin between success and failure was often determined by work that no one else saw or appreciated. Sarah's mission had saved 12 lives, but her legacy would influence thousands more, proving that true excellence created its own recognition, and that the most profound changes often came from the most unlikely sources. In the end, she had accomplished something that no ceremony could capture and no medal could represent. She had changed the way an entire profession understood and valued the kind of excellence that she had spent a lifetime developing in silence and demonstrating when it mattered most. The infinite sky would remember her passage, and the knowledge she had gained would continue to guide others toward achievements that she could only imagine but would always inspire. The weeks following her retirement ceremony brought an unexpected flood of correspondence from around the world. Letters arrived from places Sarah had never visited, written by people whose lives had been touched by her influence in ways she was only beginning to understand. A commercial airline pilot in Singapore credited her analytical methods with helping him safely navigate through a catastrophic weather system that had disabled his aircraft's primary navigation systems. A search and rescue coordinator in Norway described how her terrain assessment techniques had enabled the location of avalanche survivors in conditions that had defeated conventional search methods. Each letter represented a thread in a tapestry of influence that extended far beyond military aviation. Her techniques were being adapted by firefighting pilots who faced similar challenges in hostile environments, by medical evacuation crews who operated in urban combat zones, and by civilian rescue organizations that encountered situations where conventional procedures proved inadequate. The universal applicability of her methods reflected the fundamental nature of the principles she had developed through decades of systematic study and practice. The documentary film crews that had begun arriving at the Institute represented another dimension of her legacy. Filmmakers from 6 countries were collaborating on a comprehensive examination of her career and its impact on aviation safety worldwide. Their interviews revealed stories that Sarah herself had never heard, accounts of missions that had succeeded because someone had applied her techniques to challenges she had never imagined. The documentary would premiere simultaneously in 12 languages, ensuring that her story would reach audiences far beyond the aviation community. Sarah's transition to civilian life had been smoother than she had anticipated, largely because her work at the Institute continued to challenge her in ways that pure retirement could never have provided. The research division she now directed was developing new applications for her methods, exploring how her analytical approach to problem solving could be applied to challenges in space exploration, underwater operations, and autonomous vehicle systems. The fundamental principles that had guided her aviation career were proving relevant to any situation where human judgment had to function under extreme pressure. The International Fellowship Program had evolved into something approaching a university, with students pursuing advanced degrees in aviation science while studying under instructors who had been trained in Sarah's methods. The curriculum included not just technical training but philosophical education about the nature of excellence, the importance of preparation, and the courage required to act independently when conventional wisdom proved inadequate. Graduates of the program were being recruited by organizations worldwide, their unique training making them valuable assets in any field that required innovative problem solving. The corporate training contracts that the Institute had begun accepting represented an interesting expansion of Sarah's influence into the business world. Major corporations were discovering that her analytical methods could be applied to strategic planning, crisis management, and leadership development. The same thinking processes that had enabled her to predict enemy capabilities and develop innovative tactical solutions were proving valuable for executives who faced complex challenges in competitive environments. Sarah's speaking engagements had taken her to conferences and symposiums around the world, where she addressed audiences that included not just aviators but educators, business leaders, and government officials. Her presentations focused on the universal principles that underlay her specific achievements, emphasizing that excellence in any field required the same combination of systematic preparation, analytical thinking, and courage to act independently when circumstances demanded unconventional responses. The technological innovations that her work had inspired were beginning to appear in commercial products. Aviation electronics manufacturers had developed new display systems based on her information presentation techniques. Medical equipment companies had adopted her approach to designing user interfaces for high-stress environments. And automotive manufacturers were incorporating her safety assessment methods into autonomous vehicle development programs. The practical applications of her theoretical work were creating economic value that extended far beyond the military sector. The personal relationships that had sustained Sarah throughout her career had evolved in unexpected ways. The rescued hostages had become something approaching an extended family, their children growing up with stories of her rescue mission, and their annual reunions providing opportunities to reflect on the broader implications of her achievement. Dr. Stevens had established a foundation that funded not just aviation education, but research into the psychological factors that enabled exceptional performance under pressure. The academic recognition that her work had received reflected its significance beyond practical applications. Universities were offering courses in chain analysis, studying her methods as examples of how individual innovation could transform entire fields. Her rescue mission had become a case study in business schools, military academies, and leadership development programs, analyzed for insights that could be applied to challenges far removed from aviation. The international awards that continued to arrive reflected the global appreciation for her contributions to safety and excellence. The Royal Aeronautical Society had awarded her its highest honor. The International Association of Chiefs of Police had recognized her innovations in rescue operations, and the United Nations had presented her with its Medal for Distinguished Service in recognition of her humanitarian impact. Each award represented not just personal recognition, but validation of the principles that had guided her career. The mentorship relationships that now filled much of Sarah's time provided some of her greatest satisfaction. Young aviators from around the world sought her guidance, but so did professionals from other fields who recognized the universal applicability of her methods. Her advice consistently emphasized that excellence was not a destination, but a continuous journey of preparation, learning, and growth that required the humility to recognize one's limitations and the courage to exceed them. The research papers that Sarah had begun publishing represented her contribution to the academic literature on human performance and decision-making under extreme pressure. Her work was being cited by psychologists studying stress response, by engineers developing human-machine interfaces, and by organizational theorists examining how institutions could better recognize and develop exceptional talent. The intellectual framework that had guided her practical achievements was proving valuable for advancing human knowledge across multiple disciplines. As Sarah prepared for bed in her modest apartment near the Institute, she reflected on the day's events and the larger trajectory of her life. The quiet woman who had once been dismissed as backup had become a global symbol of excellence, but more importantly, she had created a foundation for continued advancement in human capabilities that would extend far beyond her own lifetime. The infinite sky above held promise for discoveries and achievements that she could only imagine, but the principles she had developed would continue to guide others toward those distant horizons. The legacy she was creating extended beyond individual accomplishment to represent a fundamental shift in how human societies recognized and developed exceptional capabilities. Her story had become proof that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources, that institutional limitations could be overcome through individual preparation and courage, and that the most profound changes often came from the quiet dedication of people who worked without seeking recognition until circumstances demanded that their capabilities be revealed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new students to teach, and new problems to solve. But tonight, as she had every night for decades, Sarah prepared for the possibilities that lay ahead, understanding that excellence was not an achievement to be celebrated, but a responsibility to be fulfilled through continuous service to others, who would carry her knowledge forward into an infinite future filled with possibilities that she could only imagine, but would always inspire. The morning brought news that would define the next chapter of Sarah's influence on global aviation safety. The International Civil Aviation Organization had announced the adoption of the CHUN safety standards, a comprehensive framework for pilot training and operational procedures that incorporated her methods into international aviation law. The standards would be implemented by 191 member countries, affecting every commercial airline, military aviation unit, and civilian flight operation worldwide. This represented the most significant regulatory change in aviation history, transforming her individual innovations into binding international requirements. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.